we're diving into the big one first this morning. Brace up for this conversation. As you can see, we have Mr. Kabiru Adamu joining us on the program this morning. He's a security risk management and intelligence solution consultant and CEO of Beacon Consulting. Joins us virtually this morning from the nation's capital. Good morning, Mr. Adamu. Thank you for joining us on the show. Clearly very, very interesting times for our nation, Nigeria. I mean, the elections have come. Some say it hasn't gone just yet. And now a lot of people saw the statement from the DSS warning about those who may be plotting to have an interim government by way of protests and courts to desist, saying that it will clamp down on them. And I wonder how you received that statement to begin with. For a lot of Nigerians, it was maybe shock, wondering where did this come from? But for you, what was it?
Thank you, Ayo, and good morning. Frankly, I wasn't surprised. In the play called Statecraft, the DSS has over time extended its mandate into areas that sometimes are on the fence of politics or not. So I'll take us back to a few months when the monetary policy was announced. And you would recall that the DSS at that time attempted, at least from what we saw and the reports that were made public, attempted to arrest the governor of the central bank. And in one instance, even sought to get a court warrant to arrest him on the basis of his funding of terrorism. And several other charges that were made public after that. Of course, we all know history informed us that the court turned down that request by the DSS. And then after that, we saw several attempts by the DSS to show that there were possible developments by politicians to truncate the electoral process or perhaps influence the outcome of the electoral process. Now that continued until we had a statement from the governor of Kaduna State, Governor El-Rufai, where he also intimated, in fact, before Governor El-Rufai, the president-elect also intimated that there was sabotage coming from some people within the villa attempting to truncate the electoral process, as it were. Then Governor El-Rufai made his own. At that time, he aligned it to the monetary policy or the attempt to introduce the cashless policy. Now, come to yesterday, the DSS released its own statement indicating that there was an attempt to have this truncate the transition, as it were, and then of course that it had identified people who were behind that. Now, I wasn't too surprised, mainly because the two instruments that were identified by the DSS were already at play. What are those two instruments? Litigation. Before the elections, INEC told us that it had about 600 cases that it was tied to in court. After the elections, we know, I don't know the exact number now, but on the basis of the statements that are coming from politicians who lost, we know that there are huge numbers of litigations that would be decided at the tribunals. The second instrument that was mentioned by the statement by DSS is protest, and that this protest would lead to civil strife, and that on the basis of that civil strife, they would call for an interim government. We saw that. We saw that as a result of the monetary policy. We're also seeing that at the moment. If you live in Abuja, almost on a daily basis, there are ongoing protests along Shehu Shagari Way, in the vicinity of the INEC headquarters on Zambezi Crescent. And then, of course, more recently, I think just yesterday, they went to the UN headquarters. Before that, it was ECOWAS. And then I think there was even an attempt to go to both the British High Commission and then the American Embassy. So they indicate identified those that are behind the plot. But in terms of what we saw on ground, everything pointed to the fact that, yes, there was some form of statecraft scheming going on.
First and foremost, I'm just wondering, how seriously should we take this information? What do you think that if we're taking it very seriously, what should we be doing about it?
So the DSS was set up under Decree 19 of 1986, then under the President Babangida, administration, and it has a mandate for national security, as it were. And under that mandate, it's meant to identify any threat to our national security. So speaking from that prism, any statement coming out from the DSS should be taken seriously. Now, that is me speaking theoretically. Unfortunately, however, over time, we've seen instances where instruments of state have forayed into politics. And that is what worries me at this moment. When you make such an announcement, especially in this circumstance where the threat level in the country is quite high, and I say this with all sense of responsibility. We just came out of an election that a lot of persons had forecasted that the elections would probably lead to one or two unsavory things in Nigeria. And we've come out of it quite well, I would say, given the circumstances. And so a statement like this, on the one hand, it's likely to lead to deterrence. On the other hand, unfortunately, it would lead to more uncertainty within the country, especially when you've not pointed out who are those persons that you've identified. We're also not aware, and I say this again carefully, that the DSS has arrested anyone tied to this plot. So if you ask, what should we do? As Nigerians, we've had, and we've given our confidence, as it were, to the DSS that they're making this statement on the basis of intelligence that they've gathered. But more importantly, I think, is to put forward some evidence, and then also follow that with the arrests of the persons behind the plot, especially where it's indicated that the persons have been identified.
It's very interesting that you say that, this is what we should do at this time. Because I have always wondered, every time the DSS releases a statement, what precisely they want. Is it just for the sake of information for the people? Or is it that they just want them to be aware of what it is that they have? There must be a reason why the DSS releases information, particularly on security, perhaps, giving reports on how they've heard or there is an attempt to, perhaps place bombs somewhere, or, it could be related to security. It could also be related to this sort of issue, on the bordering on the unity and the integrity and the sovereignty of the country. So I sometimes wonder what exactly the plot is, what exactly the import of releasing such statements to the public is. Is it that they don't join such protests? Is it that, what precisely do they really want? I mean, you've just tried to answer that. What precisely do they really want the public to do about the statement? But for you, I mean, when a statement like this is pushed out, when you see it, what precisely do you think that people should be doing? I'd like you to, speak to that again.
I think in the last paragraph of the statement, in fact, in the second and last paragraph of the statement, the DSS was very clear about why it's releasing, the statement. On the one hand, it called on those that are involved in the plot to desist. So that for me would be one objective of releasing the statement. Then in the last paragraph, it identifies three categories, three groups: civil society organizations, youths, and I can't immediately call the third group, where it calls them to be careful and not to inadvertently get themselves involved. If you notice, most of the protests that are ongoing are done by civil society organizations, groups that one way or the other are either directly civil society organizations or that are affiliated with civil society organizations. So I think the objective of the statement by the DSS is to tell those groups to be careful and not to be inadvertently led into this plot. Plots, as you know, have different strengths, and it's when they are put together that the objective of the plot will come out. So there are pawns within that plot that would not really know what the objective of the scheme is. They are being pushed. They would react, and I think so that is one of the objectives. But beyond that, the philosophy behind the former national security strategy. Remember, we introduced a new national security strategy in 2019, which said that the objective of our focus on security should be the citizen and not the state. The former one hurt the state before the citizen. And thirdly, it's the legacy of our colonial past as well as the legacy of our military. And don't forget that the DSS was set up, created under a military regime. So I think, thirdly, it's still operating within that prism where such statements are meant to be deterrents. So when they release such statements, the first objective is for it to deter those that would want to, participate within the philosophy. But again, like I said, that's an old strategy. The new strategy, which should have been contained under the revised National Security Strategy 2019, speaks about a citizen-centered approach to security, where you are supposed to reinforce and reassure the citizen of his security. Sadly, this statement, for most of us, if you notice, almost all the dailies that you read today had it in their front pages. You are featuring, and I'm sure a lot of other platforms will feature it today. What does it do? It raises, the current risk level, as it were, within the country and the uncertainty that the average Nigerian is having to deal with on a daily basis. So that, in my honest opinion, does not help this revised National Security Strategy 2019 that is supposed to be citizen-centered.
So I'm wondering right now, because the DSS says it has identified, because you say that is the major difference, that this has already been, brought up by all the security agencies. But the key difference right now is that the DSS says it has identified those people. Do you think that the release of a statement such as this is enough to deter them? I mean, if indeed there is such a plot, do you think that this stops those people? Because some people might just say that this is cheap blackmail. The DSS perhaps is trying to stop people from protesting, and as such has come up with such a statement, to deter people from going about what is rightfully and constitutionally their right.
So, in the DSS is an instrument of the state. It has its mandate, but in certain matters, it requires approval, as it were, a little bit above what it as an organization can do. Now, especially when it comes to politics, and in the case of Nigeria, in matters that affect religion and sometimes ethnicity, those are the two, allow me to use the word, tectonic templates upon which Nigeria lies. And there are certain actions that any arm of government or instrument of the state can take that sadly would, instead of resulting in what we want, would create more, challenges and problems for us. So in such a matter, and I know that in the past it's happened, where some of the security organizations will uncover acts that either acts of insurgency or acts that would affect the state, and they would need either presidential approval or approval from any of the other coordinators within the national security architecture. Now, this is me just theorizing. I'm not saying that this is happening. In this instance, because of the consequence of what the arrest of certain political leaders would do, if, assuming, for instance, they are the ones that are behind the plot, I would assume that the DSS would require some level of approval before it takes that kind of action. Having said that, earlier on, I used the word pawns. Most of the plotters would not be the one out on the street. They would probably be using, individuals, groups, civil society organizations. So at least that type of ground level, arrest, detention should happen, and then it would convince us that, yes, DSS is behind or on top of the situation, and it knows, like it indicated in its statement, those that are behind this plot. For now, again, I'm not aware that any of such arrest has been made. The big fish, quote unquote, would be way up the ladder, and again, I think it would require some level of approval beyond the DSS mandate, if at all there are big fish that are involved in the plot.
But one would also imagine that beyond approval, it will also require incontrovertible evidence for it to be able to make any of such arrests, especially if it is political. And because if you say that you're going to arrest anyone in this season, and you know just what exactly we have on the ground already, the chances that the protests that you're trying to stop might actually come back full force are also there. So it has to have incontrovertible evidence. Do you think that it should be providing such evidence to Nigerians?
So it's a two-way thing. Again, let's not forget that the DSS is essentially an intelligence organization, and the precepts of intelligence would make me to presume that before it comes out with such a statement, it would have gathered enough evidence, to use your word, incontrovertible evidence. Again, that is assuming that this is not a ploy in the play called statecraft. Now, in that instance, yes, it should be able to release certain arms of those evidence, because carrying Nigerians along, I still want to emphasize that that is the requirement of our revised National Security Strategy 2019, that all security organizations should be citizen-centered and that their actions should be guided by the buy-in of every Nigerian citizen. Now, releasing the elements of the evidence, the incontrovertible evidence that would not affect its investigation would definitely help the DSS in preventing, if at all there is going to be any adverse reaction if they do arrest anyone. The whole essence of, I think, that citizen-centered approach is to make sure the government, as it were, and its instruments carry people along. And one of the best ways to do that is to communicate with the people. Again, I'm yet to see that, in evidence being practiced by a lot of our organizations. That there has been improvement. I think we need to acknowledge that. If you look back at where we were to where we are today, there have been improvement. Most of the security organizations do have communications department. Some of them have even gone up to set up community relations department and name them. Others, like the military, would involve in activities to bring them closer to the people. But beyond that, I think if at all there is evidence, the investigation that is ongoing. But I think if a statement is already released, and in that statement we're told that the plotters have been identified, then there is no harm in releasing some level of this evidence so that Nigerians are carried along, especially the media. Like I mentioned earlier on, almost every daily and most of the TV platforms are out discussing this matter. And so imagine if there was enough evidence, as it were, that all these media platforms would also release. It will help convince Nigerians that there is indeed a plot, because most of the conversations that I'm hearing at the moment, there is a question of, where is the evidence? Where is the evidence? And I think it's not helpful to the DSS at this moment. So sharing that a little bit of that evidence would definitely help the DSS at this point in time.
Lots of moving parts here. By the way, the stakeholders or the groups mentioned in that statement by the DSS mentioned judicial authorities, media, and the CSOs particularly. But there are questions again as to how the DSS has been operating, and you've talked about that. And I'd like to know from your perspective, should the DSS be this visible? Should it be this audible as we've seen it do in recent times, really? Because some would say, with the name itself, DSS, it's meant to be what? Secret. It's meant to carry its activities in a clandestine manner. They shouldn't be seen as visible as they are right now, but at least the effects should be felt. Is that a right perspective or a right expectation of the DSS first?
So in intelligence, there is what is called overt operations, and there is covert operations. In overt operations, it's visible, and sometimes the essence is to be, serve as a deterrence measure, where when you see the visible aspect of that overt operation, it prevents, the would-be adversary, as it were, from carrying out an action. So I will hazard a guess to say when the DSS releases a statement like that, like I said earlier on, that's one of the intentions for it to serve as an overt operation to prevent would-be adversaries from acting. But beyond that, there is also the covert element. And the covert element is the clandestine one that operates below the radar, that sometimes infuses itself into the adversary, as it were, and the adversary would not even know that it's been penetrated, and the covert agent, as it were, is able to understand the thinking, the philosophy, the breeding, everything about the target, as it were. So I want to think that both elements are at play at the moment. The effectiveness of the two elements would determine, of course, on what the DSS has as its taskings. Let's not forget that the DSS, I keep on repeating this, it's an instrument of the state. It does not operate on its own. We want to reach a stage in Nigeria where the DSS is governed and determined by our national interest and not necessarily just an instrument of the state. I don't think we've reached that stage yet. In most African countries, we're not there. But of course, in more advanced countries, most of their intelligence organizations are governed by the interest of the state, as it were. So to that extent, both the covert and the overt operations would be working towards achieving the taskings that have been given to them by the state players. In this instance, it may be the presidency or it may be the Office of the National Security Advisor. Let's not forget that the Office of the National Security Advisor, or the person of the National Security Advisor, is the chairman of the Transition Committee, and the instruments he would be using to achieve the mandate of that chairmanship would be organizations like the DSS. So when they release such statement, I think part of the objective is to ensure that the transition is seamless. And of course, it may be an element of the overt operation. But beyond that, I want to emphasize that there definitely will be covert operations ongoing at the moment.
And as you said, there needs to be evidence presented to Nigerians, so at least they can be clear on what exactly is happening, and then there can be trust built. By the way, we say DSS a lot, but that's just self-styled. The law the name according to law is the State Security Service, but DSS is the way it's been self-styled by the agency itself. But let's just take a portion of that statement by the Department of State Service or the State Security Service. And it spoke specifically to this, saying the planners in their many meetings have weighed various options, which include, among others, to sponsor endless violent protests, mass protests in major cities to warrant a declaration of state of emergency. Another is to obtain frivolous court injunctions to forestall the inauguration of new executive administrations and legislative houses at the federal and state levels. Then it goes on to speak to specific plans about the installation of an interim government. Just before I break that part down with you, Mr. Adamu, why is interim government even coming up in the first place? Because, as we recall, Justice Dolapo Akinsoya of the Lagos High Court had declared that decree number 61 as unconstitutional, null and void. So there is a court decision on interim national government, and we know what played out in the almost 90 days of Chief Ernest Shonekan as the head of interim national government. So we've been there, and the court has decided that this is not a thing, it is unconstitutional. So really, is there any ground to even bring it up again, since it's been decided and we're under a democracy anyway?
As far as I know, my little knowledge of our laws, there is no basis anywhere for an interim government. Like you rightly cited, a court has already ruled and made that very clear. However, as someone who plays within the political space and understands the correlation or the intersection between security and politics, I know that desperate politicians have not once, not twice, toyed with this idea of an interim government. And in fact, we've had instances where respected elderly statesmen have also, advocated for this quote unquote illegality called interim government. So I'm not surprised if, like the DSS is intimating us, that there is this plot for an interim government. But suffice to say that our lawsuit does not recognize an interim government.
So, it raises the point, you can't build something on nothing. So no matter how much you say it, there are no laws. But then the other angle to this is, again, if we were to go back to 1993, the way it worked was the military government stepped aside, in quotes, and handed over to the interim government for almost 90 days, and then it was upturned again by another military government. But the way it works is that a sitting government, it's been declared, null and void, just put that. But the way it worked then was that a sitting government handed over to the interim government. So doesn't that speak again to the current administration?
Well, the reality is this: an election has taken place, and the electoral management body that is mandated by our constitution to determine the outcome of the election has declared such a political party as the winner, and we have a president-elect, and there is already, quote unquote, a timetable for the transition. Beyond that, the president has passed or has an executive order 14 that has put up a transition council that has several committees under it, and that is working assiduously. If I remember well, just 2 days ago, that council had a press briefing where it updated Nigerians on the progress of its work so far. So we know that all of this is ongoing, and that the objective of President Buhari, which he has reminded Nigerians severally, is to hand over by May 29th, and like he jokingly said, to go back to his farm in Katsina Daura and continue tending to his livestock, as it were. So to that extent, that what we are monitoring and what we see as the most probable and likely outcome of the transition is that this outgoing administration will hand over to the incoming administration on May 29th. This discussion around an interim government is null and void constitutionally. It's not something that is recognized by our law. And I honestly think anyone contemplating it is playing outside the prism of our laws and can be charged for treason. Especially if, like we discussed earlier on, there is incontrovertible evidence to support the fact that he or she is actually advocating for this interim government. It's a treasonable offense under the circumstances of what I've already described. What is available and what I have seen happening is that if you are not happy with either the process or the outcome of the elections, you go to court. The tribunals are already set up, they're there, and a lot of the politicians who are not happy, in fact, including the winners, have gone to this tribunal. And I think that should be our focus at the moment, to ensure, just like the DSS statement has indicated, that the judges also play their role. Let's not forget they are an integral part of the political process. The electoral cycle has not ended. The tribunals too are part of that process. And if they play their part well, and I'm happy that the statement by the DSS have also cited them and have called them to be nationalistic in their approach, to ensure that they carry out their activities in a manner that convinces Nigerians that they are not biased, and that they've given justice to whom it deserves. Of course, sadly, in the past, we've seen the judges, issuing out certain judgments or injunctions that sadly have been questionable. So I think the reminder by the DSS and by platforms like, media platforms like yours is absolutely important, so that the tribunals, the judges, realize that their actions could also play a part in the outcome of the elections, as it were. Again, they are part of that electoral process, and what they do would determine whether we look back at the 2023 electoral cycle and say we're happy as Nigerians that everything, including the role played by the executive, the role played by the legislature, and the role to be played by the judiciary is one that helped our national growth.
Right. So I know Markwe asked earlier that, wouldn't this look like even stifling, especially because it speaks to protests, which are lawful, peaceful protests, and also speak to, the judiciary. Everybody is free to approach the court to seek redress in one way or the other, as you have said. And yes, as you've also said, that maybe this is a move to be preemptive and maybe raise issues while things are going on behind the scenes. But in terms of the atmosphere from what you have seen? Because the protests we've seen so far were largely peaceful. I mean, we've seen some in Nasarawa State. In fact, that was led by women, mothers in Nasarawa State. We've seen protests by political parties as well, and they've been largely peaceful, at least from the major ones we have seen. But from where you sit, from your own intelligence, I would say, have you noticed anything that points to the contrary? I don't know if there's a barometer to measure the atmosphere, to maybe project on these things. Do you see things that worry you personally from this trend?
So just to clarify that in my consultancy called Beacon Consulting, we've got an element which is called atmospherics. And what atmospherics does is to pick up the sentiments, as it were, for lack of a better word, of different components of the society. That feeds into the intelligence collection capabilities that we have. So far, post the elections, apart from some of the wild jubilations that sadly resulted in the targeting of certain individuals and facilities as a result of either their political affiliation or some of the statements they've made. And I'll give examples. The saddest one for me was in Kano, when a certain musician was targeted, his office and residential accommodation was targeted, and it was touched. And then I think in parts of Zamfara State, where in wild jubilations, government facilities were destroyed, and I think 2 or 3 persons were killed in that. Since then, most of the other protests that we've seen have been largely peaceful, apart from movement disruption that they cause. Earlier on, I talked about the protests that are ongoing along Shehu Shagari Way in Abuja. If you live in Abuja and you mistakenly commute on that route, if before now you spend, let's say, 10 minutes, you probably end up spending 30 minutes to more than that, 45 minutes just passing that route. So movement disruption, sadly, unfortunately, is one of the consequences of protests like this. But there are instruments of the state who have responsibility to ensure that protests are done peacefully and that they do not result into unwanted consequences. Let's not forget that, like we've seen in the past, when protests become mass movements, the possibility of them being overtaken by other components who perhaps have ulterior motives is extremely high. And I think this is what the DSS is saying, that yes, the protests on the surface may appear to be organic, they may appear to have a very sincere objective, but underneath them there is a plan. And so I think it's the responsibility of the instruments of state, especially those that have responsibility for intelligence, to go beyond the obvious, which is an example of what we do. When I talked about atmospherics, it helps you to understand the tempo. It helps you to understand the perceptions of various elements within that are at play within the entire cycle of, even the protest itself. Who is behind it? The organization in question, who set it up? If it's a media house, as an example, what is the objective? What is the focus? What has been the message that is being portrayed? What the kind of banners and placards that are being held by the protesters? What are they saying? Is it the same sets of persons that come out today, and are they the ones that will come out tomorrow when they attempt to move from point A to point B? Are they peaceful? Are they orderly? Or do they disrupt movement? Do they go after vehicles who are commuting, innocent commuters, and then attempt to destroy their vehicles? Right. Things like that would allow the security agencies to come to a conclusion whether this is peaceful or there is another intention behind it. But at the center of all of this is intelligence, and that intelligence must be one that is able to identify who, what, when, where, and how. And of course, once there is an understanding that the objective is not in the interest of our national good, right, then there must be an action.
And these things must be done well, so they are not seen or perceived to have been politicized. Mr. Kabiru Adamu, CEO, Beacon Consulting, Security Risk Management and Intelligence Solution Consultant, thank you for giving an insight into that statement. I imagine a lot of Nigerians have some more clarity now based on your submissions. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.
We'll take a break now, and when we return, we'll focus on another big story. Yes, it's a big story day, or at least big story stay. That's in a moment. Stay with us.